Welcome to Mediation Playbook, the podcast that provides winning negotiation strategies. Join us as we explore the world of holistic negotiation from experts across business and industry. Our guests will share with us their insights and draw on their experiences to provide you the techniques and tools you need to become a master negotiator. Now let's get started. Welcome everybody to Mediation Playbook, here with our guest, Andre Gharakhanian. I'm your host, David Coher. Andre is with Silicon Legal Strategies, along with a number of other roles, which actually we'll delve into a little bit. He's an attorney, investor, amateur mixologist, semi-pro chef, and an aspiring author as well. So we'll get into all of that in a little bit. But first, Andre, welcome to Mediation Playbook. Appreciate your coming on the podcast here. So I've known you for a while. I think you've got a very interesting story. Your background and kind of how you came to what you're doing today is fascinating, I think. Would you mind sharing with our listeners just a little bit about your story and kind of how you came to end up on the podcast here today?
Yeah, it's funny because it sort of weaves the personal and the professional too. You know, you and I met in law school. We were both at Georgetown. I didn't really have a lot of direction when I started law school on what I wanted to do. And so, randomly ended up in a corporate practice, working with Fortune 100 companies, doing capital markets, M&A kind of stuff in Chicago. Was starting to get a little bit of an itch of wondering, what should I do? What's my long-term play? Do I want to be at a law firm forever? Do I want to do something different? I really didn't know. That dovetailed to the same time of you getting married and, your week-long wedding celebration. And I met a young lady at that wedding. She knows this. Everybody knows this. She was living in San Francisco at the time. And I lied to her and told her that I was planning on moving to San Francisco. I had no desire to do that whatsoever. She is my wife and the mother of my son. And, it worked out okay. I came to the Bay Area and started working for Orix Emerging Companies Group. So working for like Facebook and Pandora and all those new web high flyers in their early days. Got very excited. There's something about representing those kinds of clients, and you really live vicariously through them. There are a lot of ups and downs, and it's just so exciting. And I really caught the bug, and I said, should I join a startup? Should I start a company? And right about that time, I met a guy who was a friend and a former colleague of my Orix colleagues, and he had started his own shop. Totally intrigued by this idea of, I can't leave a large firm and walk across the street to Wells Fargo and say, dump this firm, work with me. However, as a solo practitioner, I could be the lawyer for a small startup or a small venture fund. Totally captivated by the idea, planned for it for like the next year, got the wife on board, put the money aside, emptied our dining room, went to the Office Max on 4th and Geary and bought the ugliest office furniture and desktop hutch and all this kind of stuff, and then launched Silicon Legal. And so that was October of 2007. Now we are almost 16 and a half years in. And really it's kind of the same practice, focused on startups and venture capital investors. And we're a team of 52 now, offices in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Denver, and Austin, Texas. So if I had not met this person at your wedding, I don't know where I'd be. I might be still in Chicago.
Somehow I doubt that. That's where it would all end up for you. But I am glad to see every time we talk, it's one success after another. Fantastic to hear about. The reason we're here today is to talk about negotiation and negotiation strategy. If you can think of an example of kind of a recent situation that you've had, tell us a little bit about a situation where you've encountered an opportunity where you saw value or you saw something that the other side wasn't seeing necessarily, and how were you able to position either yourself or your client in a way to take advantage of that, to capture that value that the other side wasn't seeing for themselves?
Yeah, a really vivid example comes to mind, and it's really centered around this notion of having a credible position that you truly believe in and that you also understand the value of that position. So have a large client, and the CEO was in the process of a marital settlement. and there was a loan transaction that was involved in connection with this settlement. It's all sort of a complicated financial jujitsu, but basically, my client CEO was temporarily loaned funds or promised to pay funds to his ex-spouse at a future time. That promise was backed by shares in the valuable shares of the company. And so there's a pledge on those shares. And the other side came out with just an outrageous ask after our initial offering of shares. That our offering was based on, a valuation of the company and what the value of the loan was. And they came out with just an absolutely outrageous ask to counter us. And then talking with them about the valuation methodologies, it was very clear that there wasn't a lot of conviction in a number or an understanding in what that number meant. Then it was one of those moments that was a kind of an anchoring grab of, hey, let's throw out some number and just see. And we were able to really quickly kind of peel through the layers there and get to a point where it was like, no. Here's what they're looking for. We presented the counter, and they almost just immediately accepted it. It was 5% higher than our original number. It was really sort of, illustrative of this notion of, when you're talking about the true economic indicators in a negotiation that you care about, if there's not a level of credibility there, and if there's not an understanding of the drivers, we might have different methodologies, but if you have no methodology, you're going to crumble in many circumstances. And that's really what happened here. And we're able to protect the company, protect the investors, and leave us in a much better spot. Could have been a lot scarier with a lot of stock in the company tied up in a pledge. If something happened, all of a sudden, an adverse ex-spouse, it has a lot of shares.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, do you think that there was an emotion aspect in terms of what was driving that initial offer or their initial response? Was it, no, this should be worth this certain amount?
I think so.
And not necessarily running the numbers and doing the homework of what should it be worth? What's a basis for this?
I think so. I think there was too much of an emotional component there. And also sort of not taking the time to understand sort of the nuances around the table. And that this was not spouse versus spouse. In effect, this was spouse versus my client as a CEO who has a lot of stakeholders too, that he's having to respond and be beholden to a lot of other players around the table. It's not something that he can easily move around just to get the deal done. He actually has stakeholders too. And it was the focus on the emotion and not really understanding. There are probably ways that the ex-spouse could have played into that part, but it was just purely emotion. I'm worth this, rather than really understanding the drivers.
Interesting. And it sounds unique because without understanding, the full context of their assets and whatnot, I imagine though that practically speaking, both ex-spouses, the CEO and their former spouse, their much, if not all of their wealth was tied up in the value of this company. And so in essence, the ex-spouse is one of those stakeholders as well, who's interested in the company's valuation being maintained, at least until the ex-spouse can liquidate the position. That's not an easy thing to do in those circumstances, in these types of transactions. It's interesting though, when you talk about, like, there was an idea of, here's what the value is. This is what I want. But there hadn't been the homework done to come up with an alternative justification for that. You see this a lot, like in litigation, where the parties will have an idea of the value that's involved. But the way it works in the litigation process is oftentimes you won't hire experts to come in and provide that backup, in this case, the economic valuation, until late in the process, because you're trying to fend off spending that money, right? In the litigation context, right? Because if the case is going to settle earlier, you don't want to have spent the money beforehand. The problem with that is that similarly, you'll get stuck in a position where you've taken a position as to value or as to whatever the topic might be, and you don't have anything to back that up, right? And then you have to go searching for an expert who you pay later to come up with an after the fact justification. Here, it seems like they may have been taking that kind of an approach rather than thinking on the front end, let's invest the money, let's come up with the consistent story as to how we get to whatever number we're trying to get to, and then bring that to the table. If you don't mind playing a hypothetical game with me here, but if they had done that and they had come with more of that story, do you think you would have made the same counter offer? Or do you think you would have had to go back and let's go back and look at our homework? Let's see what we did.
I think they certainly would not have been pushed over so quickly. I think
Mhm.
that we would have had to sort of then take whatever their justification was and try to, meld in how our justification actually creates value on both sides and can work with theirs. A lot of times I say that it's not necessarily our goal to convince you of this. It's more like the jujitsu. It's like, I want to know where your power is, where it's coming from, so that when we are negotiating, I can leverage that. And there's something there that's in my thought process, in my calculation, that's actually not that far away from what it is that you're doing. You might not totally agree where we land. I don't have to convince you of that. We were able to convey where we were coming from. If they had done their homework, they probably could have done something, mix it up a little bit, and forced us to then have to go a little bit higher. But it wasn't well thought out, and it was that sort of emotional response, that sort of like, I think that they just want this to be over. Of course they want it to be over, but that it was not enough.
That's interesting, and that's a good point that you bring up, that you don't have to convince the other side, and the other side doesn't have to convince you. It's not about leaving with the when you reach some kind of a deal, the deal does not have to be what both sides believe is the best value for both sides. In fact, it oftentimes is preferable if both sides think that they got something better
Yeah.
than the other side, because then the
Yeah.
deal is going to stick, right? You're going to hold on to that. I see this a lot in the litigation context, obviously, with mediations, where if you reach a deal because people get browbeaten into it through a long day of negotiations, and then they sign something at the end of the day, they may spend that time the next day. They wake up, they have buyer's remorse, and now they're trying to find a way to fight their way back into the fight of the litigation so as to capture that additional value they
Yeah.
perceive that's there, right? As opposed to if you set it up where both sides walk away thinking that they've got some deal, they've gotten something better over on the other side, that is going to starve off their desire to drive further just fighting,
Oh yeah.
right? Point blank, or renegotiation, whether it's putting together a deal or settling a
Oh yeah.
lawsuit.
And
Right?
I actually think that's a terrific concept, particularly in non-adversarial situations where this negotiation is just day one of something that's going to last a very long time. And I think that, that's a whole different breed of negotiation where there are scar tissue consequences if all you're attempting to do is optimize in that discussion. We'll see it everywhere from, employee offer negotiations to venture capital financing term sheets, where there is an eviscerate mentality that leaves everyone a little bit wrong at the end, rather than trying to get to that place where, hey, let's make sure no one can be pushed around. And that's fine. But let's also make sure that there's at least some level of satisfaction that we collaborated and created something here that can be a launch pad for go forward.
Right. I imagine that, especially your practice is something, obviously you're dealing with, it's corporate matters, you're dealing with significant companies, but because of the nature of the industry, you're dealing with closely held corporations often. You're dealing with folks, right? Because your work is, it seems, primarily, if not exclusively,
Yep.
pre-IPO work, right? And so you're dealing also with people who have poured their heart and soul into their company, into their work. Obviously, that value gets split up between them and their spouse and others through a variety of ways. But tell me a little bit about that. Maybe you have an example of some kind of a situation where that emotion has come into play, where maybe working with like a former employee or something like that, or trying to retain a new employee. How do you negotiate those situations where you have to get something from
Yeah.
someone, but there's emotion that's overarching the
Oh, I've
situation?
got a recent one and it's this sort of collision between
Good, good.
between the emotional part and also, I really have a disdain for the concept of anchoring. I think it's a useless concept. And so this was a great
Okay.
example of this, where one of our clients was acquired in Q4 of last year. So a typical component, even if it's not required under Delaware law or even in a company's charter documents, is that a buyer will want to have an elevated level of approval by the company's stockholders to the deal. They want to avoid a situation where people make claims called the dissenter's claim in Delaware or California or wherever, saying the deal was unfair. So they're like, hey, we want 90% approval of the deal, 95% approval of this deal. So this was a client that about 9 months prior, maybe a year prior, they fired the CEO, and he was one of two co-founders. And since then had raised a couple rounds of institutional funding and had some VC investors.
So he was it a he?
Yes.
He had
Yeah.
moved on, it sounds like. Okay. If I could just, how much acrimony was there
A lot.
at the time when
A
he was
lot.
fired? Okay.
And to
Yeah.
top it off, he still was left with, I want to say, like 15% of the company, 20% of the company. He had a good stake. And the worst
Okay.
part is that this acquisition was, what we call in Silicon Valley, an acqui-hire, meaning that this was not a good financial outcome for anyone. It was essentially company's assets are being bought. Some employees are joining the buyer, and that's really it.
Mm-hmm.
So the long story short of it is that the former CEO, who the buyer was requesting to consent to the deal, was in all cases going to get nothing, $0.
Is this because the asset that was being purchased then was not the intellectual property of, how to do whatever better mousetrap that the company had been working on? It was to say, hey, you guys know how to build mousetraps. I honestly don't care the quality of the mousetrap you're working on right now, but I need some mousetrap engineering talent.
Yeah.
So the people who are still here, come on over and work with my mousetrap team, and we're going to do something going forward. But your former CEO, he's out of that.
And also,
he's not a part of that at all.
Not only that, but also just the dollar level was such that essentially the way that most venture transactions are structured is that the investors have something called a liquidation preference, meaning they get paid first. Their money is protected. So if investors, for numerical example, put in $5 million, and that buys them 25% of the company, for instance. If you sold the company the next day for $5 million, even though the investors owned 25% of the company, because of that preference, they get all $5 million. So the dollar level of the deal was small enough that only the investors were getting money. And so the continuing employees got like employment packages with the buyer, but they didn't get like deal perks.
Right. They got compensated in other ways. And then your former CEO, who's got 15% stake in the company, he's got 15% equity on paper, but the way the preferences work out, he's going to end up with little to nothing out of the company. Okay.
We were in a situation where a buyer wouldn't budge. They want his consent. It effectively had been telegraphed to us that he would settle for $200,000. There were enough proceeds in the deal. Yeah. And there were enough proceeds in the deal to be able to pay this and would be fine. And so the VC board member just decides, hey, this doesn't feel right. And so I'm just going to go in with $50,000. And we're like, no, why on earth, And so he proceeds to do that, delays things probably by a week and a half, 2 weeks. We landed at $200,000. There's that kind of thing where you got emotion. Incentives are just zero for the other side to cooperate whatsoever. We have some level of information. That's wonderful. We have a means to do it. But then there's like, oh, I'm just going to anchor as if we were going to land in the middle. And
do you feel that it was the VC, there's the emotion of, I need to prove I'm a strong negotiator here? Was it? Okay. It's interesting because, I'm sure you see this all the time in terms of that dynamic of, I'm going to take a position to prove something, right? And it's emotion by another name, right?
Yeah.
It really isn't that different than the emotions that come up in familial matters or the like. But somehow it's believed to be, there's a perception out there that it's more legitimate because I'm doing it around dollars rather than doing it around an ask for child custody or something of that nature, right? Yeah. And I always find that fascinating that people have that belief in, I'm gonna be hard-nosed about this, regardless of what backs it up, because it sounds like it's a similar situation here. This particular VC board member, did he have a reason that he offered up for the $50,000 offer?
No, it was a mindless, let's do this and see, without really taking into account the leverage here. We had to do, it didn't upset the, right. And there was, zero incentive for that ex-CEO to do it. It's, I think that a lot of people, in my world, a lot of people fashion themselves as good negotiators. Many are not.
Do you think that that's because of a perception of what a good negotiator is, or do you think it's because people haven't really taken the time to study?
It's probably a combination of both. I think there is this sort of notion that a good negotiator is aggressive just for aggressive sake and jumps in and sets terms and is somehow respected out of ferocity. I think there's some level of like lore around that. And I think also just not taking the time to understand what's going to get us to the end. What's actually going to get this done, and what do I truly care about? I think that maybe some people do enjoy. I know there's people who enjoy haggling. I'm Armenian, and village says we like to haggle. That kind of thing.
Absolutely.
But this wasn't a situation that merited haggling.
One thing I find interesting about this is that there wasn't necessarily a deal where, there was no leverage over the former CEO, right? Because all you were looking for from the former CEO, this VC, was their approval of something that, in fact, you didn't technically need it. But that being said, given the circumstances, I think it was wise to seek it. And I can understand why you would seek this kind of approval, right? Because you wouldn't want the former CEO. Let's say they went ahead and did it and they had approval without his.
We could have done it.
Yeah.
But no, it was actually, it actually was needed in that the buyer made it a closing condition. They wouldn't do the deal.
Right. But they were putting that condition in place. Right. Right. And wisely. Okay. Because they were avoiding a future headache. Right. Now, who knows if the former CEO would have actually bothered to come back and litigate it or not? We'll never know, thankfully. But it's interesting that this was created by trying to avoid that future situation. And yet it then got turned around just because someone said, there's an opportunity here for me to prove I'm a strong negotiator. I'm going to come out the gates hard with this hard number. And it seems like in both these instances you've talked about, there's kind of a common theme of, if you don't have a principle behind why you're taking a position, you're going to fall down quickly. Now, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And that's one thing I'll talk about with folks, in a mediation, when they'll come in, oftentimes you'll get a brief beforehand and it will have a, shall we say, optimistic number. And I try and talk with counsel about that. And I'll say, look, you're going to need to have some reason for this, because if we're sitting in the room together, you're going to have to explain it. If you don't explain it, it's going to fall apart for you. Alternatively, if we're going to sit in separate rooms and you're going to send me over to that room, I have to have some reason, because otherwise I'm going to come back and you're going to fall apart on it. Do you have those conversations with folks? I mean, do you have clients who will come to you that will take those kinds of positions, and how do you talk them off the ledge?
It can be really difficult, because I think that with startups, it's their baby. And so what I try to do, what my team tries to do, is really get to the heart of the matter, like find out what it is they're truly trying to solve for, and try to align that with the path forward. Sort of, okay, what do we really care about here? And then how do we convey that position? So if you need to raise X amount of dollars, or you need, to have an option pool of this size, what does your hiring plan look like after you close this round?
Right.
If you have a particular deal on the table and you have to take it, that needs to orient your thinking. There are times when I just want this number can actually work when you can walk away. So it's really understanding what is your walk away? What is it that you're able to do and not able to do? And then also, what is the consequence of giving in a little bit here? Like, okay, let's let this point go. Play that out. What's the worst that could happen? A big thing with our clients is they'll raise money from VCs and they'll have to put a VC on the board. And there's a gradual sort of what we call like board creep, where the board moves from being controlled by the founders to being controlled by investors. And that happens over time. And so it's not necessarily going to happen in your first round or second. It may not be the third or fourth round. But, there's sometimes where if you don't give up a board seat to this investor, they're not going to fund you. So let's think about, let's let that go. We'll be okay with it. Let's think about what this means down the line. Let's think about how you get protected in the short term. So I think it's really try to open the client's eyes to like why giving in is okay. And then in some certain circumstances, or giving in a little bit. And then also we always encourage them. It's like, hey, you got to work with this person. This isn't like one victory.
Right.
They're going to be on your board now. They're going to be an investor now. And so there's a long-term relationship here.
Right. You need to manage those expectations for how the relationship is going to operate. And I will say that that's actually one thing that I will bring up, because I think that's a useful technique, the kind of so what technique. All right. Okay. You do this. I understand you don't want to, right? Dig through the what, but so what? So what happens next? So what happens next, right? But something that I think people don't think about a lot is, how is that working relationship going to operate for what I need to be doing otherwise, right? It's more direct in terms of operating a company. But if you'll have situations where in litigation, some litigation's pretty straightforward, right? Guy gets hit by a car, you got medical bills, whatever, you're never going to be seeing the person again, right? You're not dealing with them. You have no continuing relationship. And yet in business situations all the time, you're going to have a continuing relationship, because even if you don't necessarily between these two companies that are on the pleadings before you're in the same industry. You're going to be crossing paths again. People that work for you work for them, and vice versa, right? There's an interplay that's going to be happening in any of these circumstances that needs to be considered, because that's where you're going to be able to capture real value above and beyond the difference of I planted my flag and I got 50 grand out of the guy. Well, that's great if you end up losing several $1 million contracts because people now know that you can't play nice, right? I mean, to put it in the most simple of terms, of course. But
totally agree with that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. But I think you're right. I think that anchoring for the sake of posturing is problematic for people. And I don't know I don't know how to fix that idea. I don't know if it's something in Hollywood movies that people think these are the big bad negotiators or where that lore comes from exactly. But I think it's the folks who spend more time thinking about negotiation, who work in it day in, day out, are the ones who I see have more
Mhm.
creative answers when these problems come up, which is the fun
Yeah.
part for me, at least in my business. But thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate the time here. Where can folks find out more? I know you mentioned the firm, right?
That's right.
siliconlegal.com. I know that you recently contributed to a book that you'd mentioned, Magic Box
That's right.
Paradigm. Is that available on
Yep. Check it out
Amazon
on
or
Amazon.
your local
Yep.
bookseller, if you have one
Go
anymore?
go to B. Dalton's. I am old. No, half the audience doesn't know what B. Dalton's is.
Exactly.
But
No, I know. It is kind of sad. It's one of those things that's starting to date yourself, right? It's like a rotary dial phone or but anyway, if you have a moment, I got one more fun question for you.
yeah, of course.
Okay, great. So one game I like to play is there's kind of this idea out there about an attorney. We were talking about a moment ago, this idea of the strong-willed negotiator, right? In popular culture. What is one thing that your practice has ruined for you in pop culture, whether it's in a movie or television, some kind of a scene or some kind of a storyline? You've watched it or you've read it and you've thought to yourself, that's wholly unrealistic. That just, that broke the fourth
Oh,
wall for me.
yeah, it's definitely stuff that's in my industry. And so, like, as you
Yeah.
know, I was the first lawyer for Uber. And so watching the first episode of Super Pumped with my wife,
Mm.
it's
Hmm.
like, no,
Yeah.
no, no, this happened after this. No, no, just being critical of like, this is not how it
Right.
works. And that's not it. Or even just like watching Silicon
Right.
Valley on HBO and being like, no, this
Yeah.
takes a week. It doesn't happen like this. You can't do that. There's such a seriousness. I assume that happens to all
Yes.
lawyers when you see, because particularly the way in which what we do is so fictionalized and dramatized and
Hmm.
sexified or on TV that
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
we could poke holes in any
Yeah.
of it. So
Yeah.
that's definitely, I think that there's just a boringness to what, all of us do in our jobs that is not quite captured on the screen for good reason because no one will watch it. But
Yeah. Yeah.
that's definitely an example. Like, no, this didn't happen. No, they didn't have an office yet this time. I don't even know who this guy is. What's going on?
Yeah. Yeah. Who is that guy? What is he even doing there? That's fantastic. All right. Well, for folks that want to find out more, they can follow up at siliconlegal.com, the firm's website. And then again, go on Amazon and find Magic Box Paradigm Framework for Startup Acquisitions, which you're a contributing author on. That's your aspiring
Yes,
author
yes.
tag, right? On
Well,
more?
yeah, it could be a whole other episode, but I want
Okay.
to do a lot around building a firm and talking about what we've done in terms of
Uh-huh.
culture, in terms of
Yeah. Oh,
systems and
absolutely.
processes that needed.
No, I think that'd be a great episode actually. Talk about, because I think you guys have been one of the forerunners out there in terms of these successful firms that have taken
Mhm.
culture seriously, right? Not just a hey, we let you go to the ballpark with the summer associates. What are you
Yeah.
complaining about? Kind of an attitude that was around for so long, I feel. And yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to have you back on to talk about that and maybe work that into some of the MCLE credit in terms of wellness
Oh, very
issues and
cool. Yeah,
things of that nature, because I think you guys have been taking it
that'd
seriously
be
for a
awesome.
while. Great. Before we
Terrific.
sign
Thank
off
you
here,
so much for the opportunity. This is fantastic.
all right. Well, thanks, Andre. Appreciate the time, and thank you everyone for listening. Really appreciate it, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Mediation Playbook.
Have a great one.
Thanks for tuning in. If you found our show valuable, please subscribe to our YouTube channel for exclusive video content. We love hearing our listeners' thoughts and suggestions on guests or topics for future episodes, so please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or comment on Spotify, and we will catch you on the next one.